For those of you who were at my presentation, I gave a very didactic and theoretical presentation about the underlying philosophy in Oriental medicine with a question in the back of the, not explicit, but as part of the presentation about whether Oriental medicine is a scientific enterprise or some other way of human behavior that is not really up to this meriting being called a science. Today's presentation is going to continue that line of thought because I feel it's very important that practitioners of Oriental medicine gain the respect that Western medicine carries in our societies, and that we're not looked upon as second-class citizens, and that complementary medicine is exactly that. It's complementary to Western medicine, not above, not below. Both systems are valid and important ways of knowing about reality, and neither one is reducible to the other. So yesterday's talk, as I said, was basically theoretical and philosophical. Today's is going to be a lot more practical. So hopefully those of you who came here to learn something you can use in the clinic will find it a little bit more useful. So having said that, this title of the talk is Possession and the Seven Dragons. For those of you who were trained in the five-element Worsley tradition, this will be obviously a topic that is something that was in your syllabus, so it won't be a mystery at all as to even what the title refers to. But I understand that there are probably at least a number of people who are not coming from the Worsley five-element tradition, and the Seven Dragons might be an entirely new concept. So let me just back it up a moment to give you a frame of reference. In the five-element tradition, as Worsley taught it, he mentioned that prior to using five-element treatment strategies, one has to check for the presence or absence of certain blocks that may be necessary to deal with before five-element treatments will work effectively, either work at all or only partially work if there's a block present. And these blocks were variously enumerated as including aggressive energy, which is really a translation of the Chinese term for xie qi, or the perverse climates. Possession was one of them. Husband-wife imbalance was another one. Entry-exit blocks between the meridians in the 24-hour cycle of how each meridian connects to the subsequent one. These are all examples of different kinds of blocks. Possession was one of those. And if a patient was diagnosed as being possessed, and we'll talk about what that means, then as Worsley taught, it was important to deal with that treatment-wise before even thinking about doing a five-element treatment, let alone analysis of what was that person's constitution and causative factor. And obviously we'll have to talk about what possession is, but the dragons, Seven Dragons treatment is a name for a particular protocol of which there are two versions, one called the internal dragons, the other called the external dragons, that were taught as a way to depossess somebody, whatever that may mean, so that you actually were accessing the person in an unblocked state. And the way I learned it, and I think the orthodox teaching, is that the external dragons had some relationship to the external perverse factors in Chinese medicine, the six climates, so wind, cold, damp, etc., that there was something outside that affected the organism's ability to regulate itself, and that the internal dragons related to the emotional life of a person, where emotional distress had become so overwhelming that it blocked the ability of the organism to function normally. So we all recognize in the 5-element treatments that emotions are often the key to figuring out what's going on with somebody and how to go about normal treatment. And so we're not talking about normal emotional imbalances like I'm feeling really angry because, I got turned down for this job, and, there are 6 people that applied for it who were much less qualified than me, but because one of them is related to the uncle of the owner of the company, they got it. So I'm angry about that. That's something that's a temporary state that doesn't necessarily block your energy. It may throw you out of balance, and acupuncture treatment can help rebalance you so you can deal with that better, but it doesn't block you. The emotional, internal demons that can block you are something that's so pervasive that it actually takes over your experience of your life, so that not only are you angry about not getting the job you were expecting, but you're angry about everything in life. You're angry about your marriage, and you're angry about the relationship with your kids, and you're angry about where you live. It just colors everything in your life. And when it gets to that point, you're no longer free to react to any situation that comes at you from a position of normality. Everything is colored by your emotional state. That needs to be dealt with before you can begin trying to rebalance yourself. That's the background to this. Okay. And the reason I picked this topic was when I was invited to make a presentation, or 2 presentations this weekend, and was told that the topic, the theme for this weekend was the Shen. I gave some thought as to, in my experience, what do I know about the Shen that would be different from the standard things that everybody learns in whichever tradition you've been trained in. Because there's lots of information about the Shen, and I realized that one area that I have personal experience with that is quite different from what's taught even in the school where I learned about it is the topic of possession. And so that I actually can share with you something that you won't find anywhere else. And obviously possession, just even by the concept, is something that relates to the spirit, to Shen. When we talk about somebody who's being possessed, we're not talking about them having a physical malfunction. We're talking about their spirit having been affected. So it fits very nicely with the theme of this conference. Okay, the next slide. Anybody here recognize these individuals? Yeah? Do you know who these people are? Yeah, this is Vladimir Putin. And do you know who the other fellow is? Joe Biden, the vice president of the US. So this was a photograph that was taken in, when was this? In 2011. And if we have the next slide, I'll actually be able to read to you what was said. This was an encounter between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. And talk about people that have guts. I think Joe Biden is absolutely incredible for having said this to his face. He said, "Mr. Prime Minister, I'm looking into your eyes, and I don't think you have a soul." And Putin looked back at him and he said, he smiled and he said, "We understand one another." So I guess I should back up. This is from 2011. This is quoted in the New Yorker. And you can actually go online and see the photograph and see all the news articles about this experience. I certainly wouldn't have had the guts to say that to Putin. But, you know, I'm not a politician. I should back up just for a minute and say that in the way Worsley taught the diagnosis of possession, he really only talked about one method, and that was you look into the client's eyes, and if you see somebody staring back at you, if you make contact with them, then they're not possessed. It's in the case where you're looking in their eyes and there's nobody home, that's the indication that they're possessed. And what I'm trying to illustrate by this example is that that concept is not just specific to Chinese medicine. I think that's something that's widely held among many, many cultures, and this was just a very modern example of how even in our Western culture, we kind of have the same understanding that people do have life on the level of spirit and soul, and that the eyes are the window of the soul. I'm not, you know, I'm not the first one to use that phrase. That's a very ancient English expression, at the very least, connecting the eyes, looking in people's eyes, to the soul. And actually, I was chatting with John Hicks yesterday, and he related to me an anecdote about one time he was working with Worsley in clinic, and for some reason, I don't know why this happened, because it's the only time I've ever heard it, JR pulled out an ophthalmoscope. I don't know if you guys know what that is. It's an instrument that eye doctors use to look in the back of the eye, and he turned the little instrument on and used it to look in this patient's eyes in the back of them. And John turned to him and he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I've never seen you do anything. You know, why are you using an ophthalmoscope?" And he said, "Well, I was having trouble looking, you know, seeing if there was anybody in there. I thought maybe this would help." I found that rather amusing. Okay. So, I talked yesterday, I think, a little bit. Let me see if I remember yesterday's session. Yeah, yesterday we talked about resonance, Ganying, and how the classics referred to color, sound, odor, and emotion. Actually, in the passage I quoted, it was color, sound, odor, and flavor as corresponding, Ganying, to the pulses, and that this concept of resonance or correspondence was a fundamental underpinning of Oriental medical thought. And so in the five-element tradition, people are taught how to perceive, or not taught, but they're aimed at looking at colors, sounds, odors, and emotions as being either appropriate or inappropriate to the circumstances that the person is in, thereby indicating pathology. Are they balanced or are they out of balance in that area? And I think I related, if not yesterday, certainly in my book, that it's my belief that each of us has our own special gifts that we come into this lifetime with. Some people are brilliant thinkers, other people are brilliant artists, other people are brilliant musicians. People like J.R. Worsley were brilliant smellers and seers of color and things of that order, and certainly possibly also looking into people's eyes and seeing whether they were at home or not. Personally, I'm not one of those people who's gifted in those areas. So my struggle, actually, I was originally trained in Korean acupuncture, and I only came to 5-element acupuncture secondarily. And so I did not start out with a belief that if I didn't measure up or learn to do everything that was taught in that school, I wouldn't be a good acupuncturist. I had a much more, I'm kind of a renegade. I had a much more broad outlook that I'm here to learn, but if this doesn't match my experience, that's okay. There are other places I can look. And so I recognized, I think fairly early on, that my ability to diagnose by color, sound, odor, and emotion wasn't making it. I did that for many years, and certainly I had my successes, but I had lots of doubts about how reliable it was, including not just myself, but actually surveying lots of fellow practitioners, classmates, watching how people in the classroom situation ended up with a diagnosis, how consistently a group of students in the class would come up with the same constitutional diagnosis, which was quite rare. And even rarer was that the group that decided on what the element was, that was the diagnosis, corresponded to what Worsley said the diagnosis was. So, this was something that I think every student in that school has gone through, was mind shock of, this is ridiculous. If we can't figure it out, how are we ever going to learn to be practitioners? Well, the people that have ambition, and we'll maybe touch on that later, which is the spirit of the kidney, the willpower to say, I'm going to just go through this. I'm going to stick with it and pursue it for whatever I can get out of it till I figure it out. Those people stayed with it and found their own path, and many of them turned into great practitioners who were able to use color, sound, odor, and emotion. For instance, the Hickses, I think, John and Angela, have been exemplary in and there are others, but I'll use them as just one example in being able to use that system for diagnosis. As I said, it's not my path. And I've been in practice for 40 years as an acupuncturist, and in that time, I've kind of searched around for where is my gift. Part of it is I'm an intellectual, so I'm sure that played a role. But the other part is, for many years, I felt people's pulses, which is something that we all learn in acupuncture school in every tradition, and wondered. I actually had the same kind of questions I had about color, sound, odor, and emotion, mostly about the pulse qualities more than the pulse volume, which is what's taught in the 5-element tradition. But even within that, I felt there was some subjectivity that made me question things. But I kept doing it. I paid attention to it. And what I discovered was, first of all, there are lots of teachers of pulse diagnosis if you look around. And maybe I shouldn't say lots. There are other teachers of pulse diagnosis. And it turns out that they don't all agree about even the simplest aspects of pulse diagnosis, which is, where do you put your fingers when you take somebody's pulse? We would think this would be ground zero. Everybody would agree. There's a standard position, and we can talk about what you feel at that position, but that at least everybody would be on the same page there. Well, it's not true. If you actually look at, if those of you who have experience observing traditionally trained practitioners, maybe somebody who comes from China, maybe even somebody, if you're lucky, who came from China before the revolution, their lineage goes back before TCM, you'll notice, for instance, in New York, Jeffrey Yuen, I'm American, so I have access more to teachers who live in the States. And Jeffrey Yuen is a very popular teacher there, and I've taken a number of pulse classes with him, and his system is one that I've never seen anybody else use, which is instead of using the radial styloid as the orienting locus for where you put your fingers, he uses the ulnar styloid process as where you find the guan position, the middle position, and then brings his fingers back across to feel the radial artery at that level. That's just one variant, but there are many variants. Some people, if you watch practitioners, I have a local one, for instance, in San Francisco. There's a place that I go to buy herbs because they have good quality herbs and they're the cheapest, and it's run by a Vietnamese guy, and as a sideline, he actually also practices herbal medicine, so he diagnoses people and then makes prescriptions and sells them the herbs. And when he takes their pulses, his fingers are spread out along the radial artery, not one right next to the other. So there are many, many variations, and that for me was an inspiring insight, because I realized that maybe the reason I was having difficulties with pulse diagnosis had more to do with the fact that there were so many different claims about it that it depended on finding a standard for oneself that you could use to try to make interpretations from, and that there was a distinct possibility that maybe there was more than one place to put your fingers to find different kinds of information. And actually that's what I ended up with, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. Okay, I'm kind of lost my place here, but I think the other point I wanted to make was actually that according to Worsley, the Seven Dragons protocol, which we'll talk about later for depossessing somebody, is essentially a harmless treatment. So if you think somebody's possessed, if you have even the slightest suspicion that they're possessed, go ahead and treat them with the dragons. And worst case scenario is they weren't possessed and you've lost nothing. I'm not sure that I agree with that. I'm of the school of thought that anything that can help people when used correctly can also unbalance people when used incorrectly. And I think many of us have had experience. I've actually seen this on chat lines where practitioners have said, I've seen this with relationship to both possession and actually even aggressive energy taps, where practitioners have posted, I just did the dragons on somebody and they freaked out and I don't know what to do. You know, something that they're much worse than they were before. Or I've done an AE tap and my patient can't get off the table, they can barely move. What's going on? And the reason I bring this up is just to caution everybody that, again, going back to what I said yesterday, I think Oriental medicine is a science. There's a real physiological basis for what happens when we do acupuncture, and we should have an understanding of what's going on when we needle people, so that if something goes wrong, we know why it's gone wrong from re-examining them and figuring out what's happened to them, so that we have a next step to help, because everybody makes mistakes. Nobody ever gives perfect treatments every time. So we want to be able to troubleshoot our own practices. And so it's just a caveat that if you're going to use these depossession treatments, keep in the back of your mind that there's a possibility that the client may not respond the way you expect them to, and that you have some sense of what do you do in that case. Okay. Next slide. So what is possession and how is it treated? Paul Unschild cites three categories or three stages in the development of Chinese theories about etiology. Originally, Chinese medicine was based on ancestral influence, that, the Chinese had their tablets that they worshiped their ancestors in, and if something was going wrong in their lives, if they were suddenly suffering from gout in the big toe, what they would do would be to try to appease the ancestors whom they thought were punishing them for not sufficiently paying homage to them. And they'd bring food and prayers to the ancestral temple and hopefully recover from the pain in their big toe. So ancestral influence was the original orientation of etiology. Then it moved on to demonology, where evils such as wind, cold, damp, etc., the xie qi was felt to be the cause for why people became ill, and was widely understood in the practice of Chinese medicine at that time. And then the final stage was the system of systematic correspondence, or what I talked about yesterday as resonance, as being the basic understanding of what's going on when people become ill, that things that are resonantly important are out of balance, and that we can use things like yin-yang theory and five-element theory to understand how they're out of balance, and have lots of tools, whether it's with acupuncture or herbs or massage or sound or color, many, many ways we can use to help rebalance them. And the thing that's interesting about Chinese medicine as opposed to Western medicine is very sequential. They did something in the 19th century, then there were the discoveries of new approaches to treating illness. So everything that they used to do, like bloodletting, they threw out the window and said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Now we have cortisone and penicillin and all these wonderful wonder drugs to treat illness. And that became the standard of practice, and the old stuff was thrown away. And then new things were discovered. Cortisone wasn't so great to keep giving to people because they ended up with horrible side effects from being on chronic use of it. Penicillin turned out to be both not rarely a cause of anaphylactic shock in patients, and also germs learned how to coexist with penicillin, and so they became resistant to it, so we needed new antibiotics. And so each stage in Western medicine was seen as replacing a previous level of understanding and treatment. In Chinese medicine, that's not the way it works. In Chinese medicine, whatever was believed to be effective at any time in history was at some level retained as still having truth and still being useful even into modern day practice. Now, I'm not talking about what they do in China today in TCM, where they have eliminated some of the ancient teachings, but in my understanding of the true nature of Oriental medicine, all of these different historical levels of understanding coexist. So one can very well use modern, or the latest development, which, as I said, is systematic correspondence theory, which uses the things we all learn in acupuncture school about yin-yang and the five elements of five phases. At the same time that we can also use the concept of demonology. It doesn't mean if we use one, the other is untrue and can't be used. And it was actually in the 1100s that Chen Yen divided this concept of etiology, what causes disease, into the three categories that we recognize today, which are either exogenous illnesses, things like, that come from the poor climates, or endogenous, which we're taught are essentially illnesses caused by emotional upset, or this vast category called miscellaneous, which in Chinese actually means neither exogenous nor endogenous. It's not from the outside, it's not from the inside, and that includes diet, poor diet, intemperate lifestyle, staying up too late, not getting proper exercise, even includes constitutional factors like poor genetics, all the things that don't fit the classical external climatic factors or internal emotional factors. And Zhang Jiebing, in the Classic of Categories, which I mentioned yesterday, the Lei Jing, which was a very significant text, listed demonology as the 13th medical specialty in this third group, the miscellaneous causes of illness. So even as late as the 1600s, when we're well into systematic correspondence as the main paradigm, still demonology was recognized as a valid aspect of Chinese medical thought. Next slide. So you rarely, outside the Worsley tradition, you probably never, I shouldn't even say rarely, you probably never hear about the Seven Dragons protocol, but you may very well, and I think you probably do in most schools, hear about Sun Sum Yao's 13 ghost points as a treatment for Shen disturbances. So the 13 ghost points actually, at around the same time that I believe the Dragons protocol evolved in the Tang Dynasty, was, this is the same era that Sun Sum Yao wrote about the 13 ghost points. I don't have a pointer today like I had yesterday, so I'll have to use my fingers, but in Chenjin Yifang from 682, he talked about the 13 ghost points for treating Shen disturbances, and he attributed them actually to Bianchui, whom I showed you a picture of yesterday as the half bird, half human, who was sort of thought of mythologically as the progenitor or first acupuncturist, who was part basically it's a shamanic practice. And when we think about treating demons, we're kind of in that realm of the shaman rather than the physician, right? Because physicians are supposedly more in the realm of the material aspects that most physicians are comfortable dealing with, whereas demons are in this other realm of existence that shamans were experts at dealing with. And so this idea that the original 13 ghost points of Sun Sum Yao were the first acupuncture points that were ever discovered. Those of you who've read my book about the history of acupuncture in the footsteps of the Yellow Emperor, I talked about Jacques Lavier, who was one of Worsley's teachers, one of Van Buren's teachers, all the British schools of acupuncture leaders, originators, studied with Jacques Lavier originally, and he followed Sun Sum Yao's line of thought about the ghost points being the original acupuncture points. So let's look at the next slide. This is Pianchui. It's a stone rubbing, and you can see he's performing acupuncture. He's a half bird. He's got this long bird tail. And next slide shows, this is from one of Jacques Lavier's publications. All of his publications, except for one or two, minor ones, are basically in French, so you don't have access to them if you don't read French, and they're all out of print, so it's not easy to get a hold of them. But these show the original ghost points, which Lavier reiterated following Sun Simiao Miao as probably being the original acupuncture points that were discovered by the shaman, who were probably the first acupuncturists who were chasing demons out of the human body by sticking needles in to kill the ghosts. And these were the points that they found effective. And so people who basically had spirit level illnesses were looked at as being possessed by devils. And these were the points that the shaman found if they used weapons, arrows, needles, whatever you want to call them, to try to kill the demons at those places, miraculously restored these Shen-disturbed people to normal consciousness. Next slide. So the ghost points were the most famous, but not the only approach used for treating possession with acupuncture. And as I said, the Seven Dragons protocols are from about the same historical epoch. They're just the ones that the Worsley School used. The next slide. And Worsley learned this protocol when he was in 1966. He made his one and perhaps only trip to Taiwan, where he learned a fair amount about acupuncture and met a teacher named Xu Yangchai over on the left side here, who was a practitioner. Worsley traveled there with Malcolm Stemp, who was a homeopath, and they both apprenticed themselves to Wu Wei-ping, who was the leading Chinese medicine practitioner in Taiwan at the time. And they had a big ceremony after Worsley spent some time in clinic with Wu, following him around, learning from him, and then actually trying to show Wu Wei-ping that he already knew something and he could practice to get his approval, and was accepted as a disciple. And then there was this big dinner where Worsley and Stemp were accepted as disciples of Wu Wei-ping, and Xu Yangchai was one of the teachers who was at that dinner. And I interviewed Malcolm Stemp when I was researching Footsteps, and asked him about that trip. And he said, you know, it's funny, we went to this dinner. It's a crazy story. They had this, it's a big, you know, you can imagine Chinese banquets, which had all the dignitaries in Chinese medicine gathered there to witness this discipleship event between Worsley Stemp and Wu Wei-ping. And little did Worsley and Stemp know that at the end they were going to get stuck with the bill for this dinner for I don't know how many people. And they were aghast at the end that they had to do that. But anyway, in the middle of this dinner, or maybe afterwards, after they'd all been drinking or, you know, kanpai and having their salutes and toasts to each other, Worsley somehow connected with Xu Yangchai and went back to his room at the hotel he was staying at and spent a couple of hours there. And then, and this is an anecdote that Malcolm Stemp told me. So, and then he came back to the room that Worsley and Stemp were living in, sharing there, and he had, his eyes were aglow, ablaze, and he said, "I've got it! I finally figured it out. I figured out how this all fits together." And so I think this was a very significant moment in Worsley's understanding of Chinese medicine and acupuncture. And this is something I talked about privately with a couple of people yesterday, is I think one of the things that distinguishes Worsley and his style of practice from the other significant early figures in British acupuncture is that Worsley came from a family tradition that was, from my understanding, a fairly religious one, not in the sense of being doctrinaire about a specific religious grouping, but the spirituality behind true religion was very strong in his family background. And I think that he naturally came to acupuncture primed to find some way to connect what he already knew to Chinese medicine. And it was this event, his meeting Xu Yangchai, who taught him the Seven Dragons protocol. This is where he learned it. And this is one of the few things Worsley ever admitted to me about where he learned any specific aspect of his teachings. He was very reticent about where he learned things from. But he did, you know, I said, I think this is where you got it from. He said, yeah. So it was that moment where I think he connected his knowledge of the spirit from a religious point of view of there is something about human life that's not on the material plane, to Chinese medicine and acupuncture, that they're not really separate. They are part of the same universe, and I can learn to navigate in that world. So a very significant event. Let's look at the next slide. Oh, back up one slide just for a second. And just to point out, people have, over the years, have questioned whether Worsley made this stuff up. You know, they've questioned the whole five-element tradition as, you know, Worsley just cobbled this thing together and made up a whole bunch of stuff. But actually, I've gone through trying to document all the teachings of five-element acupuncture as having reference in the classics and other sources, which I've presented in Footsteps. And actually, Allegra Wint, who was supposed to have been here this weekend, but I think was unable to make it at the last minute, she went to a trip to China. She was a graduate of Worsley School. Actually, she was a classmate of mine. And she went to China in 1982 and found a faculty member in Yunnan at their medical school there of Chinese medicine who recognized the Dragons protocol as a treatment protocol or set of points that was contemporary Tang Dynasty for treating hysteria, actually, which, you know, hysteria is obviously a Shen disturbance. So the truth is Worsley didn't make up any of the nuts and bolts of what he teaches. What he was a genius at was putting it together into a format that could be taught to other people and to make it coherent, to explain it in a coherent way. And as I said before, he was extraordinarily gifted in terms of his sensory abilities to detect things going on with people, and this wonderful ability to recognize the higher levels of human functioning, which we're going to call the Shen, or the spiritual aspect of people, as being really significant. And the classics are clear in acupuncture terms that real acupuncture, traditional classical acupuncture, should always be rooted in the spirit level, not the physical level of people's complaints. Okay, next point, next slide. So this is Xu Yangchai and Wu Weiping in Taipei. And next slide. This is a slide from that dinner in 1966, and again, Xu Yangchai is there, just so you can see what he looked like on that day. And then this is at the banquet. And this next slide, this is Worsley and Stemp kowtowing to Wu Weiping, saying, "Please be my master, you know, accept me as your disciple." And here's Xu Yangchai looking at this thing over, you know, observing with a smile on his face of, yeah, I see this happening. And this is when it all started, when he said, I think I'm going to grab that guy and take him back to my room and tell him the truth. So I think he's ready to hear it. Okay, next slide. So what is possession? What we mean when we say somebody's possessed is that they're taken over by an entity, which, to translate from the Chinese, the word is gui. So we contrast the shen with the gui, the different kinds of spirits. The shen are the proper spirits from heaven. The gui are the lower spirits, which we can think of from earth if you want, or there are many different ways of looking at that, but the common translation of gui is as ghost. And this is just something that I copied from the internet from Lita Herman, who uses the ghost point protocols for treating Shen disturbances. But I liked in particular her explanation of what the character for gui or ghost implied, that it included the concept of a hook. And we'll look at the character in a second. And that basically what it was pointing to is anything in your life that hooks you so that you're no longer free to be really yourself is essentially a ghost that has decided to take residence in your consciousness, in your Shen, and limit your ability to be fully yourself. So it can be anything as simple as working, that when you feel like you're working too hard at everything in life, it's just not flowing. I'm sure you've all experienced this. Like there are times that everything flows very freely. I'm enjoying my work, I'm enjoying my family, and then there are other times where, God, I've seen 6 patients today, and every single one of them, I didn't have the foggiest idea of what I was doing. I couldn't get them I couldn't feel a pulse change. I'm just doing everything I can and nothing's working. There are times when we're hooked like that and we don't feel like we have access to the full range of our skills and our consciousness. Or when we're living in a toxic situation, we're in a bad marriage, and every single day is colored by feeling, oh God, this person is just bringing me down. And instead of allowing that to be, this is the really masterful way, is just saying that's their problem. It's not my problem. I'm going to go along with my day and just be whoever I am and enjoy myself. Most people can't do that. It's like, I had a fight with my wife. My day is shot already. I'm just going to carry that with me. So toxic situations, and it could be emotional toxic or physical toxic. Or severe past traumas. I was molested when I was a child, and you'll see this, millions of people that are going through psychotherapy to deal with something that happened when they were 5 years old, and they're still trying to deal with it at 35 because they're hooked. There's something that's gotten in their consciousness and altered their ability to contact their true Shen. And it's a Shen disturbance. So she recommends doing the ghost point treatments with anything that feels very hard to overcome. And she specifically calls it a block. She's saying something that's blocking you or haunting you. Okay, next slide. So here's the character for gui. This is the more modern way of writing it. This is the more ancient way. This kind of looks a little bit like a hook. Well, this looks like a fish hook, actually. And this is Viger's explanation of what this character is a dead person floating in the air, and there's this whirling energy outside, which is made by the ghost of this dead person as it moves along in life. Okay, so I'm not sure that Lita Herman's description of a hook really has any reality in terms of classical etymology, but it's, it's a useful mnemonic for understanding what the gui is about. Next slide. So my question, again, going back to yesterday, is there a way to understand the category of possession and the different protocols that are used for it that connect it to our basic understandings of Oriental medicine as they're expounded in the classics? In other words, does possession have some kind of physical correlate? And again, I'm not going to go into whether there is a real ghost that possesses a person who's possessed, meaning a spirit of another person, an ancestor, a devil, Satan, any of those things. I'm going to leave that as an open question for everybody to form their own opinion of the realm that I talked about yesterday is the world of zero, the absolutely unmanifested level of reality that 5 minutes left before break. So we can't know anything about that level objectively. What I'm going to talk about is it doesn't matter, because there's always a physical correlate with that unmanifested level. So even though everything starts from Wu-Ji at zero and turns into Tai-Ji, and the world, the Tao, expands and we're all part of that, that's the level that we live with, and we can look at that through all the other tools we have in Oriental medicine. And that's what I'm going to try to help you see, that there's a way of relating to possession and depossession treatments that are based solidly in the classical teachings of Chinese medicine, that don't have to go back to shamanic ritual as the way that we get rid of the ghosts. We can do it at the level of correspondence theory, resonance. Okay, so we have 5 minutes till break. Is there any questions from anything I've said that need to be answered before the break? I don't see any hands, so we can go on to
Yesterday you were saying about your kind of conclusion was that to meet the patient as a practitioner with an empty heart, and that was the way to strum all 25 minutes.
Yep.
I'm just thinking about how to answer that question. Is there an argument that everybody is possessed because on some level you are living your life through the predisposition of your constitution that is imbalanced? So, as we were saying yesterday, there's not many people who have that empty heart due to the fact that they're predispositioned by their own. Can you argue that everybody is possessed?
It's a question of degree. Yeah, the answer is you can make an argument about it, but as I'm going to show subsequent to the break, there is a clear diagnostic maneuver that will tell you whether somebody's possessed or not. And there's a difference between somebody being limited because of their temporary energetic state and somebody who's limited because their state has become hardened and fixed so that they don't ever shift out of it. And I'd like to restrict the use of the term possession to that latter situation. But yes, we are all restricted to one degree or another and need to work on that in order to help ourselves be as true to our nature as possible. Does that clarify that? Yeah. How are we doing on time? Still have a few minutes? Excuse me?
Can you go back to the picture where it's got points and just say which points they are?
I'm going to go over that. You mean the ghost points? No, I'm not going to go over the ghost. That's a different speech. That's a different presentation, the ghost points. They're easy to find. Just go online and Google ghost points, and they'll tell you all 13 ghost points. Okay, yeah, let's break and come back here at, what is it, 11:45?